Hey guys, this is Jackson, and this is going to be an interesting video. We're going to talk about game dev existential crises. Yeah, so when you're developing a game, an indie game, there comes a point where you start very excited, you start very enthusiastic, you start with a lot of energy, and then for days, weeks, months, or maybe even years, you work very well. You get a lot of shit done. It happens very easily. The vision's very clear. It happens, pretty quickly. Like, you're pretty impressed with yourself. You make a lot of cool shit. It starts to look really good. It's very exciting. And your game's showing a lot of promise. Just to yourself or, to other people. And then what happens, slowly but surely, is a sort of darkness settles in over the top of you, sort of creeps in from the back, all around. And before you know it, what ends up happening is that you find you might be still working, you're still doing your work, but it's become a little bit harder to get up and to motivate yourself to work on your project. It's like you feel a little bit snowed under by all the things that you've got to do. You got giant lists of fucking bugs to fix and features that are unfinished, and it's starting to feel like more of an effort to get these things done. And maybe you're not quite as quick as you were at the start. You're not quite as enthusiastic about it, but you still really want to finish it, and you sort of have all these mixed feelings. I think that's sort of the hallmark that you're approaching one of these. I call them death cycles, or it's like a death and rebirth cycle. But you're approaching a sort of a pivot point, or like a gateway, where all of your work so far has like run its course. There's been this energy that's in you that's been driving you, that's expressed itself, and it's created all this stuff, and it's sort of run its course. And now you're approaching a point where you've met the needs of that part of yourself, and you're being called to change, and the project is being called to take a new direction. And first off, this can be really difficult. This can be a very confusing and challenging thing, because I don't think there is much. I think there's very poor understanding about just cyclical living in in our culture. Maybe more so in other cultures, more tribal cultures, funnily enough, because they tend to value ritual and cycles a lot more than we do here in the West. I think here in the West, we seem to think that life is a endless fucking progress curve going up. Maybe that's reversed on the camera right now, I don't know, but maybe that way, it's like we have this idea that progress is just a ever upward march towards better and better things. And in some ways it is, because things are always moving, things are always changing. But what you'll begin to notice if you pay attention is that a lot of things in life, they occur in cycles. Everything's cyclical. It's like, if you look at the way a tree grows up like that, it drops some seeds, the tree dies, the seeds grow. It's a cycle. It's a cycle of life. It's like you look at the water. The water flows down the river, gets to the ocean, gets in the heat, evaporates, goes up into the clouds. Clouds form, clouds get heavy, rain falls at the top of the mountain, goes back down the river. Cycle. And when it comes to game development, when it comes to creative things, there's this sort of like inhale and exhale. I've talked about this in previous videos. But there's a development cycle, right? I guess there's a reason why you call it a cycle. It's like there's a beginning, there's a middle, and there's an end. And sometimes you can go through several development cycles on the same project, which is interesting. This is sort of the point that I'm getting at, is that sometimes it's like if you've got a project that you care about, you can sort of approach an ending within the project, and then go through a death and rebirth before you continue to work on the same project without necessarily publishing it in between. And this can be sort of a confusing thing for people to understand, because your motivation suddenly runs out in your project, and you're just like, oh, what the fuck do I do? I'm so stressed. I was like relying on this to be published, and like I was going to get it done by this date, but there's all this other stuff that I want to do, and I'm not ready to like publish it yet. And but yet you don't have the motivation to do it because your resources are depleted, and you're being called to do other things. And I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that that's fine. That's fine, nothing's gone wrong. Nothing's gone wrong. We think that something's gone wrong because we live so like urgently and so like rushed, you know. It's like we're always in such a rush because of, you know, the demands of like needing to make money. I think is a big one. I feel that as an indie dev anyway. It's like I want to just hurry up and just put shit out so that I can make money, but you know, there's a balance here that we've all got to walk between how much money we want to make, how much work we want to how much energy we want to dedicate solely to that, and then how much work we want to dedicate to really expressing what we find beautiful in our hearts, in our souls. And so that's something we've got to figure out. But in terms of these existential crises, look, they happen, man. They happen. There come points in the development cycle where you lose all motivation for the thing that you're working on. And if you can flip your perspective from looking at that as something wrong with you, and then, you know, getting all anxious and trying to get desperate for ways to solve it, what you actually learn is that there's a gift hidden inside those feelings of, you know, depression. Quite frankly, it's like you feel like you don't want to work, you feel like you're overwhelmed, you feel like you know, you're confused as to where to take the project. Maybe it's not meaningful to you anymore. It's like you're sort of looking at this thing that you loved so much, and now you're confused because you're like, well, you know, it seems like dog shit. It's like I've put all this time into it and I used to love it so much, but I'm not enjoying it now, and I'm sitting at my computer all day forcing myself to work, and I'm trying to find love to it again, man. Like I just want to what that is, that's denial. That's the first stage of grief. When we're going into a death cycle, they have the 5 stages of the grieving process, and the first one is denial, which is you don't. It's difficult to admit at the start because we're afraid of losing the thing that we had, but we're not yet open to seeing what might come after. You know, we're not open yet to allowing in the light that could be on the other side. And so what you're going through when you have these experiences of lack of motivation for your project and sudden meaninglessness and existential crisis in game development. Maybe this is unrelatable, by the way. Maybe this is just me, but if you're watching this far, I'm assuming it's relatable to you. What you're going through there is a death cycle. And what happens in the death cycle is it's interesting because the project does evolve. It does evolve, but what it evolves into, or it can't evolve until you let go of what it is. And so what you have to do when you start to feel those feelings of overwhelm and meaninglessness, well, there's 2 things that you can do. So the first thing is that you can wrap it up and you can publish it, and that's a good thing to do, because, you know, sometimes you don't pick these projects up again. Sometimes they die for real. It's like you start to feel these impending feelings of meaninglessness, and then, you know, you put the project away and then you never touch it again. And that happens. That's real. So, you know, sometimes the right thing to do is to drink a bunch of caffeine, get on the horse, and fucking just finish it. Just write it out and just fucking finish it. Just, you know, cut a bunch of features, cut all the shit that you didn't, like, that you wanted to put in, but you know that you're not going to be able to swing it. Just cut it all out, wrap up the fucking errors, fix the bugs, publish it, and just dust your hands with it and move on. Or, you know, maybe you can do that and then take a break. This is what I like to do. So here's a strategy for you, is whenever I develop a game, is I always develop it from the start with an exit strategy. So there's this whole, like, you know, idea of not painting yourself into a corner sort of thing. Like, because then you can't get out of the corner. You can't leave the room while the paint dries. So what you want to do is you want to paint in such a way that you've got an exit strategy. So I build my games like right from the start and package them from like day or week 1. And I always try to do my work in, I guess you call them like sprints, where, you know, you do all your features and you don't leave anything unfinished. And then you always wrap up with a packageable game that you could potentially launch. I'm not always that aggressive with it because sometimes I stretch these sprints out for, you know, months at a time. But, you know, I think it's a good habit to get into to work in those cycles where you always end up back where you started, and that you always end up with something that, you know, you can sort of walk away from. And then it's like a game of like, well, what do you commit to at a time? What do you, how much do you bite off? And I think that's a feeling based thing more than anything else. I think you have to learn to know yourself. You have to sort of predict what's going to happen in your life, and you can't always predict things. And you do make mistakes and whatever, but it's sort of a balancing act. It's a balancing act of, working in cycles. See, we're back to square one. It's all about working in cycles. So if you start to feel these feelings come on about, meaninglessness and not feeling motivated to finish your work, and you feel like this existential crisis is coming on, the first thing to do is to finish your project if you want to do that. The other thing to do is you can just leave it. So you can just let it sit and just do your best to walk away from it. And that can be hard, but it's not always final, and it doesn't have to be final. So when you walk away from it, it's not with the intention to leave it forever. It's just the intention to leave it for now. And that alone can be very scary, because it's sort of an identity death in some ways, because what you're doing is if you've been working on this thing for a long time, is that your whole routine is like bound up in working on this project. It's like your sanity and like lifeline to, reality is like you wake up in the morning and have your food and then, make a coffee or whatever and then get to work on the computer. It's like that's your routine, and if all of a sudden you're not working on that anymore, it's like it can sort of throw things into chaos. So, it's difficult, but sometimes that's what you need, because, actually the more difficult thing and the thing that's going to cause you to suffer more is working on the project in a way that you don't actually want to, in a way that's exhausting you, and, you're not finding it meaningful anymore, but you're just on the fucking treadmill, like trying to finish it. And you don't really know why, just because you're just sort of doing it out of habit. I think that's the worst place to be, actually. And ironically, that's also where you do your worst work. This is something that I've learned is, I've had projects where I've gotten to this point where, everything was going well, and then I started to feel sort of meaningless, and I thought, okay, well, I'll just push through it. I'll push through it, and maybe the love for it will come back. And so I'd like force myself to sit at the computer, and I'd just become more and more agitated. My code would get like sloppier and sloppier, and the game design that I would make would become more and more unnecessary, and I'd focus on like stupid shit, the wrong things, just because I was in this mentality of like forcing myself to sit at the computer from, X AM to whatever PM. I just had this idea that I had to sit there to work, and I would just work on like whatever I felt like I could manage, which was often just like dumb shit. And so your game development actually ends up sucking when you lose contact with the sort of driving force of inspiration. It's like when it's forced, it becomes really ugly. It becomes really ugly, and it becomes really hard. So that's a lesson that you'll learn, like I can tell you about this, but I feel like that's something you have to sort of feel and understand for yourself, like what that looks like and how that looks compared to the stuff that sort of comes out of you easily and naturally. I think the best work that we do is the stuff that comes out spontaneously. It's the stuff that we do for the sake of doing it. And then the worst stuff is the stuff that we do for ulterior motives. It's always the case, man. It's always the case. And it's not always clear cut, It's never clear cut. That's the difficult thing about it, is there's always an element of both. So it becomes a very interesting dance when you're trying to work out, okay, do I need to be more disciplined, or am I being too regimental and too strict, and is my work suffering because of it? Anyway, so yeah, what you can do is, if you find yourself in that death cycle, that crisis moment where your work is losing meaning, is to just pull away from it, man. Just pull away from it. Find something else to do. Take up another hobby. You can start another game if you want, but that's fun to do, actually. It's good to switch project, work on something fresh, try something experimental. I think that's actually really important, is trying something experimental, trying something that's risky, trying something that is, unlike you, sort of something that's different to how you normally think of yourself. Because that helps you sort of break out of the identity that you've been stuck in. It's really an identity shift. When you lose meaning and a project loses meaning, it's because you've changed as a person. And, your goals need to update with that. And so, each project, one after the next, is like a different, it's a reflection of your evolution as a human being. It's like the things that you focus on in each project, they change from project to project. And, you know, you look back at old ones and you're like, oh yeah, that was when I was like going through such and such in my life. And, you know, I really valued this and really valued this, but wasn't yet aware of this and blah, 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 and had these skills. And, you know, everything that we create, our whole, like, would you call it like an autobiography or discography of like work? It's like a reflection of a person's soul over their life. It's like the evolution of their life. And in life, we go through cycles of death and rebirth where we change. And it's something that we don't really talk about, which I mentioned at the beginning. It's something that we don't really talk about. We have a poor understanding about here in the West. But, you know, you see it in nature. You see it everywhere. Everything works cyclically. And I think the more that you can be okay with working in cycles rather than working all the time by a clock, because clocks are an artificial representation of time. Did you know that? It's what a clock represents is, you know, it's cycles. It's cycles. Like if you look at the sky, it moves in cycles. Sun rises, moon rises, day, night, day, night, day, night, day, night. The clock is a representation of cyclical patterns in nature. And when you talk about like seconds on a clock, it's like, what do you mean by seconds? It's like you have to define a second in terms of other artificial metrics, but then you can define a second by something that occurs in nature ultimately, and that's the only way to know what a second actually is it's like the time that it takes some fucking atom to decay by like X amount of, you know, percent that is really, really, really predictable and consistent, and then we can use that as a benchmark for defining time. Like that's the definition of time. Did you know that? It's grounded in natural reality. It's grounded in reality, like physicality and life experience. Our mental idea of it is not actually the real thing. The real thing is like a process in nature. And so what I'm trying to say, the point of that little tangent, is that, you know, you're cyclical, and your own life is going to have its own beat, and it has its ebbs and its flows, and its periods of expression versus periods of depression, in out. And the way that you feel about your project is your compass for navigating that. And that's the key to motivation. Motivation is a byproduct of alignment to your project, which I talked about in the last video. And your emotions are your guide to the work that you're meant to be doing. So when you feel yourself stuck in these ruts, my advice is to do your best not to resist it, basically, and to listen to it, to sort of let yourself sink into what you're feeling. You know, if you don't want to work, fucking don't work, man. As much as you can manage it, I know, because it's all none of it's clear cut. And you know, we've got to give our choices their due diligence. You can't just be careless about these things. You can't just wake up and quit your job on a whim. But also you can, if that's what you want to do. You know, you can do whatever you want. And I think as you realize that and take that seriously, you know, I think the world becomes wider and wider with more and more possibility. So if you're going through one of these game dev existential crises, is pay attention to the way that you feel and do your best not to suppress it. I think you wanna really feel what the essence of that message is. Like if you're feeling resistance to working on your project, try and understand why you're feeling resistance to working on it. You know, is it the hours that you're working? Is it the type of stuff that you're making? Is it the environment that you're in? You know, what is it specifically that's really giving you the ick, so to speak? And then, you know, the more clearly you can see what that is, the more clearly you can make changes to better put yourself back on the course of doing what you love to do and to feeling inspired and to making work that fills you with life, you know? You don't always need a break. Sometimes you just need a change. Breaks are a change, you know? They're sort of the same thing. So yeah, I might leave that one there, guys. If that was helpful, let me know. Drop me a line in the comments or whatever. I'm sort of going through a phase where I'm not reading comments at the moment, but I think I'll get to them eventually. And come hang out on Discord, check out the communities there, maybe get involved in a project, do whatever you want. All right, guys, see ya.